Hello friends, how's it going? My name's Matt Bart and you are listening to episode 128 of the Looking Sideways Action Sports podcast. Yes, it's the show where I try and uncover the most fascinating stories in action sports and other related endeavours. Episode 128. You know what that means? It means it's not long now before I start hyping episode 150, which really will be here before we know it. But until then, plenty of episodes to go, including this lovely chat with this week's guest, surfer, writer and podcaster Lauren Hill. Now, it's a small world, the old action sports podcast scene. So whenever anybody else starts one, you do tend to end up chatting quite quickly and also supporting each other's work because, you know, why wouldn't you? So through this podcasters union connection, I've ended up getting to know Lauren and chatting to her and her partner Dave a little bit. Firstly, through Lauren's work on the Water People podcast, which I'm sure people that listen to this are familiar with because we do cover, particularly with my Type 2 show, do cover similar territory. And then also through Lauren's wider work, which is really what we talk about in this conversation, including the book she's just brought out with Gestalten. Sorry, my German friends, if I've just butchered that. This book is called She Surf, The Rise of Female Surfing. I highly recommend it. It's beautifully put together and a considered piece of work which provides the most comprehensive and alternative view of modern and historical female surf culture out there, I would say. Now, I say alternative advisedly because as we discussed during our chat, surf history is a pretty male show. It's also pretty well worn insofar as there's one version that is generally accepted and told over and over again through the various sources. And as Lauren demonstrates in her book, it is far from the only story out there. So it's a considered, like I say, inclusive piece of work that is a great calling card for Lauren's general outlook on surfing and life. So whether through the book or the podcast, she's tackling big, important themes which we need to discuss more and more in a really graceful, accessible way. And that's why I was so keen to get her on the show, really. So we discussed all this, as well as the idea that story is a choice, how the objectification of women in surf culture affects men as well as women, the importance of play, and a lot more weighty topics that don't really get enough of an airing in our little world. It's a good one, this. I really enjoyed it. Lauren's great. And a big wide-ranging conversation that was right up my boulevard. I'll be back at the end for the usual wrap-up. But in the meantime, here's me and Lauren Hill. Story is a choice. Enjoy. Did you have a chance to check it out at all, or are you? I'm sure you know the drill. It's not groundbreaking what I'm doing, really.
No, it's great though. I haven't been listening to many podcasts lately, actually.
Yeah, I go through phases as well. Sometimes
Yeah.
I'm like super on it, and then other times I kind of drop it a bit.
Yeah, same. Yeah, just in waves, huh?
Yeah. But yeah, just a general chat, really.
Cool.
Like I don't ever approach this with any kind of agenda. Just have a conversation. Got a few things to chat about, but yeah, let's just see how we go, really.
Okay.
Yeah. So tell me about this autumn that you've been having. Then it sounds, from where I'm sitting, it's quite envy inducing.
Well, I think the prospect of getting to live in Australia at all is pretty envy-inducing. I pretty much every day feel totally grateful to get to live here and call this place home. And I was paddling out at one of our local points this morning, and there were 2 to 4 foot little peelers running down the line, super clear water. The humpback migration is in full effect right now, so big humpback pectoral fins were splashing out the back, and yeah, it's just been a really dreamy season of super consistent waves, beautiful sand formation on the points, and just really lovely conditions. We've been so blessed to have like a little haven of surfing despite all the chaos going on in the world right now.
Yeah, I was going to say that must be a real relief after. I mean, obviously everyone's dealing with the COVID situation, but particularly where you are, because you're on the East Coast up in Byron, right? For people
Yeah.
that are listening that don't know.
Yeah,
But obviously,
we're just outside of Byron on our little rural property.
yeah. So I mean, it looks amazing. But yeah, it's been a tough year ecologically, right, for that part of the world. So I imagine this is a real nice relief, right?
Yeah, it is. We had, some of the most devastating fires of all time in Australia. And then to follow that up in our region, we actually had major flooding because the earth just was so dry and wasn't ready for water quite yet, especially not in the in the quantity that we got. And now we're just having sort of quite a wet winter, but that's okay. It feels like things are balancing out and mellowing out compared to how we've been going earlier in the year.
Yeah. So where are you from originally?
I'm from Florida. I'm from a little barrier island off the coast of Florida called Anastasia. So I grew up surrounded by water and playing in tide pools and in the intercoastal waterway. Yeah, it was a sweet place to grow up.
And how long have you been over on the East Coast then?
10 years, a decade. Yeah, I first came to Australia in 2006 on a student exchange. I was doing an environmental science degree through my uni in Florida, and from high school I was pretty much dead set on visiting Australia. And so I came over and fell in love with the land and the surf, of course, and have ended up having a family here and falling more deeply in love with the land and the water here and getting to stay, which is just the hugest blessing.
Yeah, made a life there, right? Which seems to be seems like you guys have carved out a really lovely little corner of the world for yourselves.
For sure. I feel really grateful to get to have someone as a partner who is also a surf rat and prioritizes, wind and swell. Not above everything, but above most things.
Yeah.
So that's really given me permission to do the same. I think we do that for each other, and it makes life sweet and easier, not having to explain the beautiful addiction that we call wave riding.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's quite funny to arrange this, wasn't it? Because we were both like, you're like, we've got waves, might have to give it a couple of days, and then rarely I could say that as well. I was like, well, actually, I've got waves, so I might have to give it a couple of days.
Absolutely.
But when you earlier you said you were always drawn to Australia, was that because it was a good combination of your interests? Because obviously, you're passionate about surfing, and also you mentioned the studies that you were doing in environmental science, which from looking at your work seems to be a really consistent theme and lens through which you view the world and surf culture, if that's not too big a stretch. So was that kind of part of what drew you to Australia, like the fact it was a combination of where you could explore those interests?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you nailed it. But at first it was just an intuitive sort of pull. I was 20 and I didn't actually know very much about Australia besides like having watched Single Fin Yellow and been totally drawn to Bo Young's section here in Byron and just wanting to surf waves here.
Yeah, Byron has that effect, doesn't it? First time I went to Australia, it was like, right, I've got to go and check that place out.
Yeah, and I just found like there's something about the colors here in particular, the particular shades of turquoisey blue and bright green of the headlands juxtaposed next to each other. They just feel really therapeutic for me. And so I think that spoke to me first. And then as I grew into my environmental studies and wanting to find a way to blend surfing and feminism and environmentalism kind of came together naturally, and I ended up finding my way back to Australia, and really falling into a community here where all of those ideas weren't quite as radically off-putting as maybe they were from most of the people I was around in the South.
Right. You're talking about surf culture specifically there, are you? As in those ideas being seen as unconventional, let's put it. Even though
In the
clearly in the
South.
mainstream, yeah. Even though clearly it's in the south of the States, you mean?
Yeah.
Sure. Right. Okay. Because
Yeah. I mean, I remember, gosh, just being made fun of for being a hippie and being like a hairy feminist, and I grew up in a pack of boys who surfed and loved Taylor Steele and Momentum Generation, and I was a longboarder riding heavy single fins, and with kind of left of center ideas, and that didn't make sense to a lot of my friends there.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I guess that even riding those boards at that time would have been definitely a way of standing out, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and largely thanks to Thomas Campbell. I mean, I just can't credit his films, especially The Seedling, enough with showing me what feminine surfing could look like, because there weren't really that many women surfing around me at that point in the early 2000s. So, to see Cassia and Belinda riding heavy single fin logs in such a deeply feminine way, but with, extreme technical skill. That was super inspiring.
And the ideas that you mentioned as being unconventional in the South, was that obviously culturally where you come from by the sounds of it, then that's not the easiest thing. It wasn't around that much, those ideas that. So how did you start to develop that way of thinking about the world?
I mean, like for so many of us, surfing really gifts us that insight into being a part of a world where we get to feel small, we get to feel humble, and we get to witness other life forms and be in a very non-human space where we get to feel vulnerable, and we get to interact with this spontaneous, fluid environment. I mean, it's magical. It's so magical. And I don't know how people can surf and not feel a responsibility to care for those places that gift us, the joys, the highlights of our lives, really. What sort of baffles me about surfing all the time is that it can flip a totally mundane day into something extraordinary with one wave, I
had that yesterday. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's funny because like I was explaining before we started recording, and as my listeners will be no doubt bored of hearing, like where I surf, it's really shit, basically. But it's still, it almost makes it more rewarding. Like yesterday I got one wave, which was great, really fun, nothing to write home about, but a proper wave. And yeah, it did change my day, like completely. And also, it's almost because it's so incongruous, like given how challenging it can be where I surf, because it is wind swell, there's no lineup, it's just kind of chaos, really. And yeah, I think I totally understand what you're saying. Like that is a constantly rewarding thing about surfing, isn't it? No matter
Totally.
like whether it's the classic sort of, beautiful picturesque wave that you surf to the best of your ability, or the junkiest day in the world where a wave that you catch surprises you, it can still give you that thing, can't it?
Absolutely. And I can totally relate, because I grew up surfing totally shit waves too. I mean,
Yeah,
Florida
right.
is just a perfectly long, straight closeout, basically. And you just are lucky to find your corners, and it makes you so grateful as a surfer. When there are waves, you are on it. Not like Australians. Australians are so spoiled. It's amazing how a slight imperfection in wind direction is enough for an Australian to say, it'll be better in a couple days. I'll just wait.
Yeah, I always love bringing Aussies to where we surf. I've got a couple of close friends who've moved over here, and they're always just a bit like, "Are you fucking joking?" Whereas we're like, "Well, yeah, it is what it is." Yeah. Well, it sounds like you right. So did that, as you describe it, did that influence the type of boards you were surfing then? Because let's be honest, it's easier and it's more fun to surf bigger boards like that in these kind of waves. It's more forgiving. You can surf, for me anyway, you can surf a bit more freely on those types of boards, unless you're like really super talented, super proficient on a short board. It's definitely more, for me anyway, it influences the type of board that I like to surf at, which is generally long boards or high volume, something that's a bit more flowy really.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're dealing with a really long, shallow continental shelf that slows down waves to like molasses, and you're surfing wind swell anyway, it's like, why would you not ride a board with lots of foam that you just get your wave count up? It just made sense to ride longboards in Florida.
Yeah, definitely. So the by the sounds of it, the culture of surfing and an awakening of your place in the natural world, and then your interest in these other ideas begin to sort of coalesce in the way that you want to view the world.
Yeah, and really through university. I mean, I was surfing competitively, like doing some professional longboard contests through high school, and then I had to make this decision about whether to go on this big trip with my sponsor at the time, and I was going to have to drop out of high school. But I decided not to. I decided to go to university, and I figured that was sort of a clean breaking point from the idea of professional surfing. So I went to a small liberal arts college in Florida, which was just amazing, super small class sizes, and I had really beautiful relationships with my professors, and they just really, one in particular, Dr. Tony Abbott, he just encouraged me to follow my curiosity, and he validated my passion for wanting to culturally critique surfing just as a way of like trying to make it better. Like I wanted to look at how surfing could be seen as environmentally destructive, from what our boards are made out of, our travel, in terms of gender. I just wanted to ask those questions, and everyone's doing that now, and people were doing it then too, but it felt novel for me at the time, and because I was encouraged to go down that route, that really ended up shaping my career path thereafter.
So important that mentor, encouraging teacher figure, isn't it? Like I certainly can empathize with that. Like having people, when you're at that formative stage and you try to work out your ideas and try to find a path, especially one that can relate to what you're interested in. Because as you describe, I think it probably was pretty unusual at that point to try and combine those things, and to use surfing as a lens through which to explore those ideas. And yeah, like having that kind of that mentor or inspirational figure that can say, yeah, that's totally valid, is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, it was huge for me. I ended up publishing a thesis straight out of my undergraduate degree, and then I don't know if you want me to keep going from here.
Yeah,
should I keep going?
Yeah, this is this is the good stuff.
So I graduated in 2008, just amidst the global financial crisis. And I was young and super motivated, and I wanted to do environmental work. I wanted to make a difference in the world. So I applied for all of these jobs in like DC and New York and San Francisco, and I cut my hair short and bought pencil skirts and collared shirts, and I was going to go to work in the city for a big environmental NGO and do what I had been taught to think of as important work.
Sure.
But there were no jobs. There were no jobs then for someone fresh out of university. So I had a fair amount of student loan debt to pay back. So I just had to get menial jobs like waiting table. Well, I actually only lasted 2 days waiting tables because it was way too difficult for me. I did not suit, my personality type didn't suit it at all, but I was like a deckhand at a marina and just all kinds of random jobs to pay off my student loans. And because of that, I had this intellectual freedom because I was doing menial work to start writing and to start blogging. And I just started a blog and started bringing, those ideas together in written form. And then from there, I started working with brands again and somehow found my way back into sponsored surfing, which was a total surprise to me.
That's interesting. So you deviated from, because you mentioned that you competed and stuff. So it's almost like just to try and join the dots a little bit. So I guess, yeah, growing up in Florida, you've got that choice if you want to pursue a professional surfing career of like that classic sort of contest route, sure. And then, but you found a way of exploring these ideas and then bringing it back into a way of having that career path that combined the things you were more interested in by taking a different route, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I kind of carved out a little niche for myself. I've worked with all three of the big sort of surf brands and with Billabong for the longest of those. And yeah, for a while there, I was traveling and storytelling and trying to dip into local environmental work on any travels and writing and making films about surfing and women surfing in particular along the way. And that was sort of my job for a while.
Great. Yeah, because you've obviously, I do full show notes for these episodes, so I'll link to some of these projects that you're talking about. It was always this lens. I keep using this phrase just because it's convenient, really. But like to try and explore these social and environmental issues. And you used the phrase earlier to try and change surfing. And one of the things I will say that I've noticed about your work is you're very, very inclusive. You're really careful not to, because it'd be quite easy, I think, and it can be quite easy to sort of point out the obvious, which is how white and male modern, I'm going to say modern, not traditional surf culture is.
Yeah.
And it'd be quite easy to kind of attack that, really. But your work is inclusive. I really noticed that in the book and on your podcast as well. Like, it's, and that I think that's a really smart move because, it doesn't, but you did use the phrase like to change it earlier as if that was a goal. So I guess my question is, was that always the strategy that you adhered to try and almost like change it from the inside, as it were?
I guess so. I mean, probably the first goal, selfishly, was to have a good time and get good waves.
I mean, that's allowed. That's always the goal.
Yeah. I don't want to seem like a martyr or anything. I'm definitely not. I'm fully
I don't think anyone's going to watch your films, and I won't worry about that.
Yeah.
There's clearly been a lot of good waves over the years and a lot of good trips.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, though? Like, it's just
Yeah.
it's interesting hearing you phrase it like that.
I guess, I mean, like I said earlier, I guess growing up surrounded by all boys, being the only girl in my little boy pack, at a certain point, when we were 14 or 15, I remember going to the Surf Expo, which is like the big gathering of all the surf industry brands, and being there and seeing the Reef Brazil models and the sort of half-naked women who were employed to go around and hand out stickers for all the brands. And I just remember feeling, I don't really belong here. Like, there's a certain role that women are expected to play in surf culture, and I'm not fitting into that. So I'm like, I felt othered. I felt excluded from a place that I really wanted to belong to a sport and a culture that I loved, that helped raise me. And so I guess that feeling of otheredness just gave me empathy for other people who maybe, I mean, I look like I like fit the stereotype to a T. I've got blonde hair and blue eyes, and I still felt like I didn't belong in this culture. So I it's made me deeply empathetic for other people who don't get to see people who look like them, who who have lifestyles like they do, or come from cultures or ethnicities who aren't represented in surf culture. So yeah, I've always wanted to just help dilate representations of what surfers look like in general.
And when you're faced with that classic objectification, like a depiction of female surfing, which is essentially about the male gaze, it's about like objectifying women for men. I think we can pretty clearly say that, and you use the word othering, which I think is really pertinent, because it's denied as well, isn't it? That's the thing, whenever you get these incidents. So, and there's been a couple of famous ones over the years. I'm thinking of the Steph Gilmore kind of Roxy film, which obviously was probably the thing that got, even then, when there's really like I'm thinking of Corey Schumacher, who probably critiqued it the most. In what I just felt was a completely indisputable way, and it was still denied. It was still like, no, that's not what's happening here, and you're wrong if you think that. And so how do you try and find a way of being positive in the face of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just interested in finding the middle ground and making sure everyone has a legitimate choice, especially women and girls. And I mean men and boys too. I think representations of women impact boys and men, maybe not exactly equally, but definitely deeply and profoundly. In different
I think
ways.
that's again inarguable, isn't it? Because it influences as much the way that men see and then subsequently treat women, doesn't it? Especially
Absolutely.
in something as powerful as surf culture. For a young boy,
Yeah, I've seen the way masculinity puts boys and men into boxes too, unfairly and to completely, unattainable expectations. And so I guess what I'm interested in is dancing those lines between how do we acknowledge the inherent sensuality of surfing, of women's surfing, without tipping into objectification, and it takes time to find that middle ground, and it's different for every surfer, for every for everybody. And then how do we do it without neutering it too? I'm really interested in that middle ground, and just having the conversations. I think just asking the questions is the best most of us can do. Just keep asking, like, is that too far? Is that not far enough?
Do you see a change? Do you feel like because I think even if we talk about the period with that we're discussing, where you mentioned growing up in that very male surf environment to now, and you said like at the time you felt like it was probably quite unusual and conventional, however you want to phrase it, to even think that way, to now. I'm guessing it's probably like a couple of decades or whatever. Like, is that, are you seeing a change? Are you seeing a receptiveness to thinking of the culture in a different way, as we're talking about?
Oh yeah, I think it's changed so much. Surf culture in so many ways has expanded in terms of design, like openness to different kinds of boards. We had a period there where everything was about the stark white thruster. Even surfers in Florida were riding them for waves that they were completely inappropriate for. And that was a huge disservice.
Leads to the worst style in board sports history as well, doesn't it? Like the wide need, when the pump.
So bad. To think so of much work. It's just so
hard
much
to think
work.
of an uglier sight, really, in any. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that was the kind of an example of it, isn't it? The way It was all a narrowing of context, if you like, about, well, this is what it is, you know. So yeah, you look at it in that way, that's now, I mean, it is clearly much broader, isn't it?
Yeah, it's changed so much. And the way that environmentalism has really been brought into the definitions of what it means to a surfer, to what it means to be a surfer all around the world, that's changed radically in the last 2 decades. What hasn't changed, or maybe what I see as what's maybe even gone backwards, is the way that some of the endemic women's surf brands are moving away from ability-focused surf marketing and back toward using models again. And then social media has made things super complicated too, because professional women surfers through the last 10 years were kind of presented with this this model of how to make money. It's like, the more you get your gear off, the more you're paid. Kind of like, that's the equation. And lots of women are exploiting that on social media and making a really good living. And there are quite a few women who aren't going that route, and maybe who aren't making as much money, and that's okay too. But that's still a big part of the conversation for me, is to ask, is it a legitimate choice when nudity and sexuality are incentivized above all else as an athlete?
Yeah, because the argument's always, I guess, about like how much you're in control of that image and how much it is a symptom of this sort of patriarchal structure, isn't it, really? Which is a classic, I guess, discussion in feminism generally, isn't it? In any whatever part of the world you discuss, in whatever cultural area you're discussing, it's not limited to surfing. Let's put it that way.
No, yeah, surfing's just a microcosm of what's going on. Broader.
And what are your views on that then? That kind of conundrum, if you like.
Oh gosh, I'm just always really mindful to never critique surfers, but to critique the system.
Yeah.
Because most of the surfers are young women trying to make a living doing the thing that they love, and they're going to do it by any means possible, and that's totally fine. What needs to change is the way that those pathways have been institutionalized and narrowed. And, I think, for all that the WSL gets critiqued, I think that their step to provide equal pay for men and women was a big one. It's a big symbolic one. And I was really proud of that.
They deserve credit for that, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think the backstory, I think their hand was forced to do that.
Yeah.
Have you read into some of the big ways?
I spoke to Corey for the podcast, and I've spoke to Sachi Cunningham for the show as well. I'm not sure if you know Sachi. She's a photographer from San Francisco. Yeah. So I know a bit about that. Yeah. The fact that there was a lot of pressure, basically, and a lot of really smart campaigning as well, I think, to get there. Not just attacking in broad strokes, actually looking at the subtleties involved and using sort of messaging to get that outcome. I mentioned that because, again, I think there's a parallel with the way that you approach this as well, with the work that you do, as I mentioned earlier. So yeah, I mean, it didn't just happen in a vacuum, that did it? I guess that's the point,
Yeah, that's right. And I don't know, I'm just interested in those women getting credit for changing the face of our sport, for changing the way young boys and young girls view men and women surfers. Because as I've grown up within surfing, women's surfing has always pretty much been portrayed in a comparative lens. Like, the biggest compliment you could get as a girl surfer growing up is you surf like a guy.
Yeah, and it's the classic sort of prize money argument, isn't it? Whether it's tennis, surfing, performance-related argument, like, well, you're not worth the money because you're not as good, essentially. And that's another way why that decision deserves credit, because, that is just in every sport in the world, that is the stick that's used to beat women's performance with, isn't it? So the fact that surfing actually did break that is and basically say, well, it isn't necessarily about that, because that's the message that sends, isn't it? You know, it's not a like for like comparison, and that it shouldn't be judged upon that. You know, there are different ways to judge this, basically, which is an important step, I think, isn't it? You know.
I mean, and just to allude to the book a little bit, and maybe this is an uncommon or an unpopular belief, but I kind of feel like women's surfing is different than men's surfing, and I'm okay with that. Like, I don't think they have to be compared as equals. I think they have different strengths and weaknesses, like a male ballerina and a female ballerina, you know, like flexibility is different, and we have different physical forms that are capable of different ranges of motion and different strengths, and I'm really interested in seeing where women's surfing can go when it isn't only trying to aspire to the way men do it.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the book, and obviously we should. Don't worry, I was going to bring it up.
That's okay if you didn't. That would be fine.
No, the book is great, and you know, one of the things that I really noticed about the book is, and the stories that you choose speak to that. You know, this, like, because you've chosen such a broad cross section of female surfing, and yeah, there's a couple of performance themes in there, but it's really not about, you know. So I guess the question is, was that was intentional, I guess, to try and convey as many different female surf stories as possible that didn't come under this traditional, you know, umbrella by which it's usually sort of talked about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, technical skill was majorly important for me, because women's surfing has also been so prone to lifestyleization, you know, just like blue water and palm trees and posing on beaches. I did that for years and it's fine, but it doesn't really tell the story of, you know, the progress of women's surfing. So technicality was definitely in there, and inclusion was, like you said, the other major priority. Just trying to, and we spoke about this a little bit already, dilate the meaning of what it means to be a water woman right now, what it looks like, what, you know, and just making sure that different shades and shapes and ability levels are represented, because endemic surf media right now is struggling first and has very little funding. But even still, when I go on to surfermag.com or Surfline, it's still kind of rare to see women included in those spaces. And I don't really understand why. And so I wanted to create this book as a touchstone for women, and hopefully men and girls, and hopefully boys, to be able to look and see, oh, like, a woman who surfs doesn't just look hairless and tanned and, you know, blonde and blue-eyed. She can look like all different kinds of things and be from many, many bizarrely different countries and cultures from around the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of different stories out there that aren't covered by traditional depictions of female surfing, basically. And I think one of the points you make there is really important. I often just think, because the industry is so white and male and also young, like, you know, I just think it's off their radar a lot of the time, and they wouldn't even know how to handle it or address it, even if they were aware of it, you know. And I think I'm not excusing it at all.
No, but I think that's important. That's important. It's like, I don't think about it in terms of conspiracy or anything.
No, exactly. I agree. I think it's just almost like not on the radar, and then even when it does come on the radar, it's just out of the comfort zone. It's just easier to cover the same shit, really. And what is interesting about that is, like you say, it's not like the surf media is thriving right now. You know, it isn't. There's a couple of things that are probably doing quite well, but the same messaging doesn't appear to be leading to huge growth in the industry.
Yeah.
So it is an interesting question, like why there isn't more diverse voices, because there's clearly an appetite for it, and it
Yeah.
probably would be more reflective of the reality, and also be healthier for the culture on not only the level we're talking about, but to be honest, on a financial level, really,
Mm.
which is an equally valid motivator, I think, in this sort of conversation. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I watched the so in the late 90s, early 2000s, well, early 2000s more so, when Hollywood's version of Blue Crush came out, there was this huge surge of support for women surfing, like in contests, and there were tons of different women's surf magazines. And I got to benefit from that as a young girl who could rip out like 20 pictures of women surfing from magazines and put them on my wall and aspire to levels of surfing that I wasn't able to, you know, to reach at that point. And then as the economy started to wither a bit, the support for women surfing really got scrapped, and surfing media just refused to integrate. That's what it felt like. But it was always like, why would you not want to expand your market? Why would you neglect what was probably then 15% of the surf population, and now maybe 20, maybe 30% of the surf population in the US? Why would you not want to speak to those people and sell more magazines? Yeah, it just
yeah, it is actually baffling, really, when you
yeah.
because it is like we say, it's not like this industry's coming from this position of rude health, is it? It's I think in any of these cultures, apart from skate maybe, but certainly snowboarding and surfing, could certainly do with an injection of new people. Like to try and well, there's going to be a lot of people disagreeing with that statement when it comes to surfing on a particular level, but
Yeah.
on the when we are talking about media and industry, it just seems like it is in their interest to do it, which is what makes it all the more baffling, really.
Hmm. And
Yeah,
what's so beautiful about surfing culture compared to skate or snow culture is that we have this ancient lineage that is deeply rooted in inclusivity.
yeah.
In
Well, one of the lines that really stood out in the book is when you said, our primarily white, Western, masculine, middle class incarnation of surfing culture is the exception of history, not the rule.
Hmm.
And like we're at the thin end of this. It's narrow now, but that is historic. That is atypical historically, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, we what I loved about one of the things that I loved about writing the book was getting to touch base again with all the different cultures that have had their own incarnations of surfing, like dynastic China. We're talking about a more than 1,000-year-old surfing culture that had nothing to do with Polynesia at all. They had their completely independent surfing culture and history. And then the same can be said for South America. Um, and so, and really, I think any beach around the world, whether they've seen surfing in the mainstream or not, it's just surfing, riding waves is a natural act, I think. I mean, it was just an act of efficiency, probably to start, catching waves on fishing boats, and then for kids to just be drawn into the ocean to play. Like that's true of any beach anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it looks like you had a lot of fun coming up with the stories in the book. Like really, really, really does come across. Like because what a brilliant privilege to be able to represent those different stories like that. And yeah, like I've been, the word that did spring to mind is inclusive, and consensus, really. Like to try and you make the point about the male history of surfing, but it's not in an exclusive way. It's a way of saying, yeah, fine, but let's think about this other reality which is just not been talked about, really. And yeah, some amazing stories in there, which must have been really, really fun to uncover.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's kind of the culmination of the last 10 years of traveling and meeting women all over the world, in the water and learning about their lives and being so inspired by the different ways they allow surfing to shape them, and they're shaping surfing in their own communities. So yeah, it's been a huge privilege to really be entrusted with those stories and, collating them and sharing them in one sort of book that is trying to shift the narrative a little bit.
Was it, it must have also been satisfying on a creative level, I guess, because as you mentioned earlier, you've been exploring a lot of these ideas through your blog and your writing anyway for a long time. So, what a great way of having a big physical culmination of all that work to put into something like this.
Yeah, I'm kind of an analog person to start with. I like the feeling of holding the weight of a book and the smell and being able to read without the glare of a screen. So yeah, to have something physical to show for it feels really good. It was just a huge dream of mine to put a book together. And this book in particular is something that I've tried to write for many years, and I've pitched to different surf entities, and I've always kind of gotten knocked back, but it felt really good to find a publisher. Well, they actually reached out to me, just Dalton in Europe, who really believed in the way that I saw women surfing as this global community of very diverse, creative, technical athletes and artists, and they let me sort of run with that angle, which hasn't been the case. There are other women's surfing books, and they're different than that.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of surfing history books, and that history is, it's fairly well told, isn't it? I really like the chapters about Polynesian history because it was just different from the stuff you normally read, frankly. There's that traditional, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it's male. It's a male story. So yeah, there are characters that are alluded to, but it's good. You obviously really give platforms to female pioneers whose stories perhaps aren't that well known compared to others, which is, I just really enjoyed reading that because, it is pretty well trod narrative, isn't it? The kind of history of surfing, really.
Yeah, my partner Dave Rastovich, he's just an absolute champion of women's surfing, and we've traveled together for many years surfing and interviewing people, and now interviewing folks for our own podcast. And he always says, it's crazy that surfing media recycles the same stories from the same white dudes over and over again, the Jerry Lopez's and the Akis and, the guys that we all know and admire, and rightfully so, of course. But it's like, there are all of these incredible stories that haven't been told that are just fascinating. And what are our journalists in surf media doing if they're not asking questions about how to uncover new stories?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I've thought about this a lot actually with my own show and platform recently, because I kind of realized that I was also guilty of propagating the same thing, even by the guests that I was choosing. You can, and I guess my point is that history, those stories that you tell, they're choices. They're not stone tablets that are like on the hill to be adhered to. They are choices. And that is the same for history, which is primarily a white story of colonialism and, whatever. And it's the same in surfing. It's the same in anything, and it isn't obligatory to tell that same story. There are, and I've just found that I've been having a lot of conversations on this podcast in the last couple of weeks just around that. And yeah, kind of, even though I think I've tried to probably be quite diverse and to give different stories and opinions, I kind of realized that still kind of taking the easy road a lot of the time, still kind of choosing those. So yeah, it's just interesting. It's worth remembering. It's a choice.
Well, we all do. We fall into the areas where we're comfortable speaking, especially as a podcast host. you know, from a place of expertise, and it's uncomfortable to grow. I mean, as we're all finding with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're all having to be stretched into places of discomfort to recognize our inherent biases, and that's hard and it's humbling, but it's so healthy, and it feels good when we can move through some of those, you know, some of those blocks.
And it's worth remembering, it's a conscious thing, that like it's a choice that you make. And yeah, and that again, you know, just to bring it back to the book, that's why I just thought it was, and as Dave obviously said, the point you made, this is a different choice about those stories, and it was refreshing to see, definitely. One of the other questions I had for you, a word that you use a lot, you've used it a lot in this conversation and use it a lot in the book, is play, like the concept of play. So obviously something, you know, we can all recognize that in surfing and all these activities that we all love, you know, that they're inherently playful. I mean, I was lucky enough to go snowboarding in Lebanon once, and the locals didn't really know what, I mean, you know, they did know what it was, I'm not going to say that, but they called it playing snowboarding, which I always thought was brilliant. They would say to us, like, you're going to go and play snowboarding, as in you would refer to like playing football or cricket or something. And is that like a conscious decision to kind of remind through the way you communicate it that it is inherently a playful act that we all share?
Yeah, definitely, for two different reasons, I guess. The first is a reminder that surfing, like, sometimes we take surfing too seriously. You know, we get angry in the lineup and we splash water, or we come in bummed after doing something that is just pure privilege. Like, to get to go and spend 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours in the water frolicking around in water is just an incredible privilege and a delight if we can let go of some of the seriousness of that.
Yeah.
And then secondarily is like exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite is that play is an evolutionary tactic that has made our species what it is. To be able to play, the characteristic of neoteny, or the retention of childlike characteristics, is what has kept us evolving and adapting, and has made us one of the most biologically successful species to have existed on the planet, because play gets us out of our minds and into our bodies and allows for spontaneity and new things to happen and new ideas to arrive, and surfing can be part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so worth remembering, especially like you say, when you can become so caught up in the ego conversation with yourself as well, you know, like, oh, I'm not getting what I want out of it for this reason, or, you know, and you turn it into something very, very different from that, you know. And like you say, there's a cultural angle to that as well, because a big part of the conversation is territorial. It promotes that ego side of it, doesn't it? It promotes that kind of, almost like it's a fight, it's a battle, you know. You're going into battle, especially when you go somewhere new.
Sorry,
can be quite easy to forget that essential truth, which is it's supposed to be a laugh. It's supposed to be fun.
It's actually absurd. Like, we're sliding across lumps of water sideways on a piece of foam. Like, it's silly. It's really silly.
Yeah. I always think that whenever again, especially where I surf, it's so bad. And but people get so aggressive about it, and I was just a bit like, look where we are. You know,
I do exactly the same thing but at really perfect point breaks here when it's pumping. Like, I just feel like, look at where we are. Like, how can you be angry in this setting with all of this to get to bask in? Like, how can you have anything but gratitude? Not that I don't get angry in crowded lineups. I do sometimes too, but I try to come back to that. Like, We're lucky. We're like the most privileged of the most privileged people on the planet to get to have the gift of riding waves to come back to all the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you mentioned the podcast, obviously. So another avenue through which you can explore these ideas. So how are you finding that?
Uh, I just love asking questions. I had a cat and a dog when I was growing up, when I was probably like 7 or 8, and my cat's name was What and my dog's name was Why. Literally the most ridiculous pet names ever, but I just feel like that speaks to like, I don't know, questions were just always in me. And so to be able to have an avenue for question asking and, you know, being allowed to just barrage people with as many questions as I could come up with is fun and satisfying. And then also to get to practice deep listening, you know, to be able to feel into other people's experiences and stories. Our podcast, the Water People podcast, is really about storytelling, raw and authentic, and trying to encourage people to go into places that mainstream surf media doesn't necessarily have the space or the time or the length to go into. So we try to focus on that. And that's, I mean, there's just nothing better than getting to sit and listen to someone go into their lived experience in a really vulnerable way. It is captivating.
It's a great medium for it, definitely. And you can tell, you know, these choices that you've been making with who you've been speaking to, you know, are also giving this alternative narrative and view, which I think is, as we're saying, you know, there's this huge appetite for it. I think that's probably, you know, I think it's no coincidence that podcasts are having a moment right now, because, you know, they can kind of scratch that itch in a different way, can't they? You know.
Yeah, and I love that they leave space for imagination too, you know, in a way that visuals can be overwhelming to, you know, our visual senses. Podcasts let you imagine, and they keep that space for imagination. And that's what I really enjoy about, you know, listening to podcasts myself.
Yeah. So it's Water People, and the book is, I've got it right here, She Surf, The Rise of Female Surfing. So like I say, I will put links in the show notes so that people can check out your work. Do you guys have a website or anything? Is there anywhere like it's all collected?
Yeah, waterpeoplepodcast.com.
Great. Hey, Lauren, that was really great. Thank you. Aww. Thanks so much for doing it. Glad we finally sorted out our surf schedules and time difference to get it done.
I'm so stoked for you that you got to get surf. I was happy to postpone for that. That's the priority for sure. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for your work. And hopefully you get to share some water time someday.
Yeah, defo. Well, when I spoke to Dave, he was like, if you're in Byron, it's like, well, I'm going to hold you to that. So
yeah, come on down.
So there you go. That was me and Lauren discussing her new book, She Surf, her podcast, Water People, and her fascinating career of ideas in the surf industry. As ever, you can find full show notes over at www.wearelookingsideways.com. If you want to find out more about some of the topics we discussed in this episode, you can find Water People at all the usual podcast outlets. And I do really urge you to check out She Surf. If nothing else, like I keep saying, it's really beautifully put together. And there's just a lot of different voices and perspectives in there that you won't have really found, as we chatted about in the conversation, through wider surf media. And there's also some names that you will know. So yeah, it's a good one. Head over to the website www.wearelookingsideways.com to find out more about that and all the links. Speaking of books, segue alert. Thought it was about time for an update on the book project myself and Owen Tozer have been working on. Now, as mentioned over the last few months, we have been steadily working on this book project since we got back from California last year. We did have funding for it, which fell through once COVID kicked in. So we've decided finally to just use Kickstarter for it, which I did talk about the other week, but I'm going to be talking about it a lot over the next few months, I would imagine. So we're going to try for an August launch. Owen is pretty much waiting for me, really, because he's kind of done most of his bit. And I'm a lot busier than him. So I've kind of got July penciled in for this one. It's going to mean a few early starts for me, but that's all good. I will be hyping the shite out of it on here and through my various channels. But yeah, basically, if it's going to happen, we're going to need people to get behind it. For me, it's really just a way of exploring the themes that came up from California and also just showcasing Owen's work, because he'll never do it himself and because his work's brilliant and deserves a bigger platform. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. We do have contributions. Jamie Brissick has contributed an essay. I've written a little essay. Cersei Wallace is going to be writing something, and Craig Peterson is going to be writing something. Those were all guests from our California trip, and they've all very kindly agreed to get behind the project. So, yeah, we're pretty stoked about this one. Should be good. Speaking of extracurricular activities that literally nobody else has asked for, I've been chatting to a good friend of mine about a Looking Sideways festival concept. At the moment, we've been chatting about some kind of do lectures times meltdown festival scenario. You know, nothing massive, but exhibitions, guest speakers, an exchange of ideas in a nice place, live podcasts, that type of thing. There's a lot of this type of thing around at the minute. You know, I've already just mentioned the Do Lectures, which is probably the most well known. There's loads of retreats out there. I mean, some of the big podcasters doing Rich Roll does his retreats. I've got friends who run retreats. A lot of them are based around, you know, yoga and breath work and the like. Probably won't be doing any of that, to be honest, on my little thing if it ever happens. And to be honest, as with most of this stuff, I probably won't really do it unless I can add something that's slightly more interesting or unusual, because there's a lot of stuff which ticks the same boxes out there. But it's a nice thought right now. You know, the venue's going to be pretty important for one thing. But yeah, bit of a conversation that's ongoing. If it leads anywhere, I'll keep you posted. But let me know your thoughts on this idea. Email me at podcast@wearelookingsideways.com. Or you can direct message me at We Look Sideways over on Instagram. So thanks to everybody who sent me kind words about the Active Minds podcast I did the other week. I'm being asked to do more and more podcasts at the minute as a guest, which is really fun. I'm always very grateful when people are interested in hearing my story. And yeah, Active Minds seemed to strike quite a chord, which was interesting. So if you enjoyed that, there's more episodes up there now, including with DJ Barbecue, Sean Lee and others. And I think if you enjoy this show, you're going to also enjoy that one. So go and check it out. Active Minds. It's on the usual platforms. Go and have a gander. All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I will be back soon. Nice one.